We'll just hold on just another minute or so, and then we will get started. Thanks for your patience. All right, well, I'm showing that it's a couple minutes after the hour, depending on where you are. Where I'm calling from, it's Eastern Time. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, as I said, calling from Eastern Time, so it's a little after 1. And welcome to the second in a series of CQL webinars. My name is Ann Beekner. Kate McLean and I will be your facilitators this afternoon for constructing community options, community mapping with Lenny's Getting Connected. I've been with CQL for almost 10 years now. Today's topic about community and CQL's role in partnering with organizations on community life is very important to me and has become even more pertinent in our current climate and current conditions of the economy and all the situations that each of the organizations we've been working with have been experiencing. And I'll let Kate introduce a little bit about herself.
Hi, I'm Kate McLean, and I'm coming to you today from the state of Kansas, home of Dorothy and Toto. And I was telling Ann and Susan earlier that we have tornado warnings today, so hopefully I won't blow away before the end of the webinar.
Thanks, Kate. Today's topic, as I mentioned, is constructing community options, community mapping. We will be talking through some points today using Lenny. Lenny, who you see here on the bottom right hand of the PowerPoint presentation, is a fictitious person, but if you think of him, he's really someone who represents people we support in our work. If you've participated in any of the other CQL webinars in this series, then you have been introduced to Lenny before, particularly in our webinars that are about rights and about social roles. Today we're going to build on some of these themes and take a look at community, both from Lenny's point of view individually and then from the organizations who are supporting him. One of the things I just want to go over before we truly get into the webinar, some of the materials, they would have been sent out ahead of time. So if by chance you've had a chance to look at them, great. If not, we will be referencing them throughout the webinar this afternoon. If you don't have them, if you would please let us know and we'll make sure to get you copies of them afterwards. There should be a sample community map document. There should be also a document that is a larger document, which includes, I think, about 15 pages of data to consider questions and sense of belonging questions. And then you should also have a handout which is titled a community support chart. And as I mentioned, we will be referencing those throughout. So a little bit before we truly get started and get more into the meat of this, let's make sure that everyone is connected both on the web and on the phone. If by chance there are issues with regard to either one of those, well, I suppose if it's phone you wouldn't be able to tell, but particularly if you have any questions or issues, there is a chat log on the right side of your screen that if you need to let us know something's going on, there's a kind of a green box there for you to type in any of your questions or any of your concerns. Susan, if you could just put your cursor there, then people could maybe see where that is on the right-hand side of the screen. Down at the bottom right is where that is. So that's where you'll see a box that indicates there's some tools available for the webinar. So that's where they are. And Susan has just typed in if there are any questions or any issues. She can be reached at her cell phone number, and let me just tell you what that is if you can't read it or are further away from the screen. It's 410-458-1112, and if by chance you may want to just jot that down. If there's anything that were to come up technically during the course of the webinar, you may want to have that so that you could call in. The number is 410-458-1112, and that's Susan Syme, who's helping to run the PowerPoint presentation. Also, I wanted to point out that since it's not an interactive webinar at this point, we would like for us to be able to engage with you, though, if you have questions at the end of the webinar. So if you wouldn't mind, if there are questions or issues that come up, if you would be so kind as to go ahead and log those questions into that chat box, write your questions, and we'll cover as many of them as we can later in the session. Also, during the webinar, we're going to take a few minutes throughout the session to ask you to participate in several polls. You will have a chance to respond to some of the questions or the polls about people and about community. Just one thing to point out is that we'll be able to view the responses as a whole in the aggregate, but no one's individual or personal answer will be seen on the screen. It's all being kept confidential, so it will just be tabulating totals versus looking at individual responses. And we will review the questions that come up as, at the polls or the surveys as we get to them throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, please make sure to type them into that box there, and we will get them at the end of the session. And if there's any technical issues, please be sure to try to reach Susan Syme at that number just in case something were to go wrong. All right, so it looks like, not seeing anything typed in there, it looks like everybody's ready, so why don't we get started? Okay, and Susan is doing us the favor of facilitating moving our slides forward, so we really appreciate that. Kate and I are in different locations, and Susan's in different locations. So what you'll see on the first screen of the presentation should be a typical map of what we're seeing in our community mappings today, and we'd like to orient everybody to what this typical town looks like. This picture represents Lenny's community. It could be anyone's community in reality. We'll explore through Lenny some ideas and processes for Lenny to get connected with and be a part of the community, as well as the organizations that are supporting Lenny on how they can develop their community connections and become a bridging organization. You'll see some buildings and some streets and a few vehicles throughout the picture in front of you. We're going to reintroduce the community, as I said, in the context of community mapping for Lenny, as well as for the organization which supports him as we move along this afternoon. Just a bit about the Council on Quality and Leadership, about who we are. We're an international non-for-profit organization, and we've got a history of over 35 years of experience in the definition, the measurement, and improvement of personal quality of life for people with disabilities and people with mental illness. You'll see on the screen in front of you what CQL's vision and mission are. For me, our mission of quality of life truly represents what today's webinar is all about, because we know from our experience that quality of life occurs in the community. And we are committed to doing this work until our work is complete. And that's what our vision is inclusion for all people. Just a little bit about some definitions here about what is community and about what is sharing and what is belonging. You'll see on the screen in front of you a couple things popping up, several pictures on the slide, and these really represent what we're referencing when we say community. Community provides to all of us a sense of belonging. There may be certain facets of our community that we share. It could be in our interests, such as our local environment, or even our global environment. And with today's virtual world, it makes sharing and belonging to a larger environment even that much more accessible. Being a part of the community might also be in our history or our heritage. This may be our ancestry. Our shared communities might exist due to cultural or ethnicity connections. The collectively shared factors define what our community are. For sharing and belonging, we're going to talk a little bit more and delve into the term of social capital. And we'd like to acknowledge that some of you may have been present for a previous webinar on social roles. However, it's important for us to recognize and know that there is a bit of a distinction between social roles and social capital, and that's why we wanted to take some time today to just reinforce that. It's important to know certainly people's preferences on their social roles as we further explore social capital and community mapping. So there is somewhat of a link there, but there are some distinctions that we're going to go over with you. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what social capital is. Some of the common themes are popping up there in front of you. There are three fundamental themes or elements of social capital that I think it's important that we stress this afternoon. One of them is that the first one being social networks, and these are the connections that we have among and between people. The reciprocity, the give and take and the sharing, and not having to renegotiate each time with someone or with an entity. And then the other theme, the third theme listed there is trust, and without it, there really is no sense of community. So those are sort of the three fundamental elements that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about what defining social capital might be. Social capital, just as a point of reference, is also a universal term. It's understood through a body of academic measurement and theory, and it's not just about disability. In fact, you can Google or do an internet search under social capital, and you'll find thousands and thousands of websites which deal with social capital, and they certainly are not solely linked with a disability focus. Just to distinguish some of the other types of capital that we might be thinking about, one of them in general terms, there's generally considered three types of capital. The first type of capital to distinguish social capital is one called economic capital, and this is the financial capital, the dollars that you have in your wallet or your bank, the resources and the assets that you have available to you. Another type of capital is human capital, and that's capital that we carry around with us in our head. It's our education and our experiences that we have. And then social capital, what really distinguishes this from the other two types of capital is it's really in our relationships and in how we are able to leverage connections through those relationships. And for people that we support, it's been my experience that people we support generally are living at or near or below the poverty line. So economic capital is something that generally people who are supported don't have a lot of. And also in terms of academic letters or titles or diplomas, that human capital that I was talking about, that's not generally something that we've experienced a lot of people have much exposure to. So therefore, even increases the importance of why social capital is so much more important for people who don't have the other types of capital, the economic capital or the human capital. So this brings us to our first polling question, and we are going to, through the process of the webinar, also it will be on the screen, but we're also going to take a moment to read through the questions or the polling statements as we go through this. And the first one that should be coming up on your screen is social capital is based upon financial status. And your options to answer that are true or false. And we know that some of the attendees today are participating in larger groups, so we're going to take a moment for the groups to build a consensus and get a response. Social capital is based upon financial status, and then your response choices are either true or false. So let us take a minute for everyone to respond, and then we will show and discuss the group's answers. And just as a reminder, there will be no one's individual response shown. It will all be tabulated for us. So we'll give a couple more seconds here. And Susan, when you see, a good percentage coming in, if you wouldn't mind just kind of letting us know when that is, I'd appreciate it. We were thinking of playing the music from, where were we thinking of playing the music from, Kate?
I don't remember.
It was one of the game shows. All right, social capital is based upon financial status, and the selection of answers was true or false. And we're seeing that at this point, while we closed the polling, 86% of the respondents said that that is false. So we're understanding through that people are seeing that social capital is based maybe more on connections and access to other networks. Now, there were 14% of the people who responded that that the statement was true. And actually, there may be some support in achieving social capital, that having maybe larger financial resources could be supportive of, with maybe broadening our depth or our breadth can be opened up by a little bit more financial resources. However, really what we're talking about are those connections and the access to the networks with the trust and reciprocity. So I appreciate everyone's participation in this first polling question. But it leads us directly to our second polling question, which is going to follow. And again, I'll take a moment to read the quick poll question to you. Most people with intellectual or developmental disabilities have an abundance of economic and human capital. And again, you have the choice of responding either true or false. Let me read it just one more time, and then we'll give everybody a minute or two to respond. Most people with intellectual or developmental disabilities have an abundance of economic and human capital. And your selections to respond are true or false. So let's give everybody a couple seconds to do that. All right. Wow. Okay. So we have 100% of the respondents to the polling statement saying that it is false, that most people with intellectual disabilities, intellectual developmental disabilities, they do not have an abundance of economic and human capital. So I'm assuming that in the discussions that I had earlier, that sort of brought out some of the experiences that you all have seen or experienced yourselves in supporting people or in living with people who are supported through your organization. So thank you for that. It absolutely does highlight the importance of social capital, in that there is not a lot of resource possibly that people have, nor is there a lot of experience or education that people have, which again reinforces why building those connections and having that sense of reciprocal trust is so important. So thank you for your time in responding to that. All right, now we want to talk a little bit about a quotation that we find is pretty important in, again, helping to define what we're talking about in connections, and what we're hoping that this may support organizations and people that you support to develop these connections through our discussions today on the webinars. People live in communities, and the quote here is, "Don't confuse connection, which is feeling a part of something larger than yourself, feeling close to another person or group, feeling welcomed and understood, with context. because contacts are something very different. Now, all of us may have a contact or know someone through someone, and it absolutely can be a contact, but it does not mean that we have that sense of reciprocity and trust and feeling of being connected to a larger network. So I wanted to point that out, that the terms connection and contact are quite different when we're referencing social capital and building and the benefits of social capital. You'll see also that on the slide there is a copy of a CQL publication titled Social Capital Index. This is one, as I said, a publication CQL has produced. And in brief, within that publication, you'll find a clear correlation between certain personal outcome measures and social capital. And Susan has put up what the website here is for you if you'd care to look at this. This is a document you can download in a PDF file and is free for you to use within your organizations. Within this index, within this publication, it's a very simple index, and I am not a mathematician, and I can figure it out myself, so that should be something. There is a simple yet thorough way to calculate and identify where people and organizations might wish to focus their efforts in promoting social capital. So if you have some familiarization with personal outcomes or with some of the quality of life indicators that will connect with personal outcomes, this index and the way it's used for organizations can be extremely, extremely helpful. Just to let you know that that is available, and it is something that is offered for free at this point. To support quality of life, what I'm sure organizations who are on today and people who are supporting others throughout internationally, organizations should be about supporting people to live in their community and accomplish their personal goals in community. The challenge ahead of organizations today is that organizations really are looking at how to change their roles in becoming bridging organizations, and that we bridge both ways, back and forth. When you think and visualize a bridge, that's really what we're talking about, the two-way play on that. And then also building social capital, both for the organization itself and especially for people who are supported within the organization. As we talk about some of the aspects of social capital, there's two different types of social capital that organizations may want to focus on, which brings us to our next slide on bonding and bridging capital. And first of all, you'll see the slides come up there with a picture of the television show Friends, but we've all heard the song from the Beatles. Well, maybe I'm dating myself, but we've all heard the song from the Beatles called I Get By With a Little Help from My Friends. And that's actually one of the areas that I'll talk about when we talk about bonding social capital. The Friends television show is a great example of social capital with trust and reciprocity and accessing networks, that through this group they were able to access other networks, connect with other people, and have influence and find leverage. The other show, which again will date me, is the other television show that comes to mind is an older television show called Cheers, where the opening title song was Where Everybody Knows Your Name. And again, that would have been a perfect example of how people connect through their community into other aspects that are important to them. Now let's just explore a little bit about the two types of social capital here. The bonding social capital, we're still on the other one. The bonding social capital is the super glue, which allows us to not have to renegotiate each time. It's about promoting a sense of reciprocity and trust among fellow citizens, maybe with the same race or same ethnic group or same age or same religion. So that's bonding, where we are promoting it among like interests. The second type of social capital is bridging social capital, and this is promoting reciprocity and trust across the divides of race or class or age or religion. It's kind of the social WD-40, if you're familiar with that. It sort of greases the wheel, so to speak. And if any of you are familiar with the personal outcomes, and if you were to look back at that social capital index, It will identify which outcomes belong to bonding and which outcomes fall more under bridging. But just to give you an example or two, bonding social capital, if organizations are wanting to look at how they can promote bonding social capital and the supports that do that and organizational strategies to support that. With people having friends is an outcome, people participating in the life of the community, and people being connected to their natural supports would all be considered bonding social capital outcomes, which promote that trust and reciprocity among fellow citizens of the same interest. Now, bridging social capital, on the other hand, is really looking to promote this beyond the divides of that interest group. So bridging social capital might be people performing different social roles or people interacting with other members of the community. But as I said, you'll get a lot more information if you just were to go to that website and download the Social Capital Index. So on the next slide, you're going to see a little bit more about the reintroduction, or just a final summation of the types of social capital that we've been talking, or the types of capital that we've been talking about. And again, need to be very clear that social capital applies not only to people, but to organizations as well. So when we're looking at framing social capital, we need to look at it from the 2 points of view of organizations and of people supported. And we are going to be talking today about how to build some social capital for organizations and for the people within that organization. Social capital links you to people you know in positions of power or who have leverage. The relationships become reciprocal. There's that give and take. And with that, organizations, members, and people involved in the organization can be involved in everyday life and the future of the community. So that's why we really do want to place a very firm understanding on social capital, because of how much it supports and is a huge stepping stone to building community connections for people and for organizations. Just another quick example that I would like to explore is you'll see on the top right-hand corner of the slide, there's a picture of Mr. Donald Trump. And what I'd like to do is see if we can talk just a little bit about him. He has what appears to me, this is only my very unfamiliar assessment, to be more than enough sufficient economic capital. He has assets and resources and dollars in his wallet. And with that, he can always purchase or have access to that human capital of experience and education and those who can support him in his visions of what he's doing. With that thought, I just have a short survey question to pose to you, which leads us into our next slide. Just for kind of discussion purposes, the next polling question that should be coming up for you would be, or actually it is, the quick poll question. If you had to make an educated guess, how important would developing social capital be to Mr. Trump? The question is, if you had to make an educated guess, how important would developing social capital be to Mr. Trump? And then your answers are very important, somewhat important, or not very. Very important, somewhat important, or not very important. I'll give everybody a minute or two to work through that. All right, let's see what our quick poll responses were. All right, we have 74% of the respondents saying that social capital is very important to Mr. Trump, 19% saying somewhat important, and 6% saying not very important. Jokingly, I just need to say that I certainly don't know anything about Mr. Trump's life other than what we all read or see in the newspaper or on the news, and that I have no personal knowledge of him whatsoever. And other than what he most likely wants us to know. And I'm kind of afraid if he found out about this, he might have me fired. Ha, 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 small joke there. Sorry, that's just a Wednesday afternoon joke. But actually, there is no answer that is incorrect or correct on this one. Social capital absolutely is something that he wants to have those connections. That's how he's going to be making his leverage and making his deals. Not only is it important for him to have money and that educational capital, but those connections and a sense of trust and reciprocity that he knows if he does this for someone or someone does that for him, that there will be that two-way street there. And it allows us, social capital allows us to delve into the fact that that if he has this, it allows him to delve into new areas, to new arenas, and that having those relationships might be extremely important to him. And if he does not have those relationships, he certainly has his people who could do that for him or who might have that social capital connection. So appreciate that you taking the time to respond to that. And now I am going to try to turn this over to Kate. She said she may have lost her computer connection, so we will see if she's back on the call. Kate, are you able to pick up?
I am back.
All right.
All right.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I thought it might be helpful as we start out to first talk a little bit about what community mapping is in general before we apply it to the work that we do as organizations and with the people that we support. Mapping techniques are tools that enable us to better understand our community. Mapping encompasses a wide range of techniques from very simple maps that are literally hand-drawn on a piece of paper to very high-tech, database-driven, interactive, computerized maps. A couple of examples of mapping I think might be helpful. A couple of examples of the different kinds of mapping might be helpful. And before I move ahead, I just want to let Susan know that I'm still seeing the quick poll slide and wondered if everybody else was seeing the other one.
I think it's just you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep talking and just say next slide. How's that? I'm offline again, I guess. Okay. In one project, college students from different parts of the country were asked to map life in their college community. And how they worked it out was to go to their favorite hangouts in the community with GPS devices. And sometimes they also documented the location with a digital camera. And then they downloaded the GPS coordinates and their digital pictures to a central location. And all of the input from many students in different college campuses around the country was compiled to create a map of life for those students in each college community. And that's one example of a fairly high-tech or more high-tech way of looking at the community mapping. In another project, in villages in Africa, villagers mapped their community using hand-drawn maps and simple icons. They used the maps to identify the needs and resources in their community. And some of the women that lived in those villages used the information from the maps to find a niche for new businesses that they then started up. And that's a very simple, kind of crude method of looking at community mapping. Both are very effective, and both can be used to help plan what a different organization or group of people are going to be doing. Some forms of mapping use diagrams or charts containing lists of assets and resources in their community. This technique has been used in working to enhance disadvantaged neighborhoods in the U.S. One example of that is asset-based mapping. And there's some work that we're going to talk about a little bit more later by McKnight and Kretzmann, where they use this kind of mapping technique in neighborhoods in Chicago. No matter what the technology or style of mapping, the point is to develop a picture or a visual representation of the important things about the community. So community mapping is a visual way to characterize data or information with relation to a geographic area. What does community mapping do for you? Mapping is a way of drawing a picture of what things are like now. Mapping can also be a vehicle for depicting what we want our community to become in the future. And then sharing the maps. Susan, we're still on what does mapping do for you? Sharing the maps gives us a way to develop a common understanding of where we are and of where we're headed. Maps make it easier to develop consensus about patterns that exist now and about future direction.
Just keep talking. Just keep talking.
Okay.
I got lost.
Okay. We're way back behind you. So we'll talk about two different kinds of mapping. Mapping can be a useful tool for people's planning teams as they work towards supporting the person and becoming more involved in the community and in building social capital. When used for this purpose, the map is about the places in the community that the person goes. So first thing is how the planning teams are going to use the map and develop consensus about what the person's life in the community is like now and what it'll be like in the future. We're also going to talk about organizational mapping and what the place is of organizations in the community. We know from our experience that the people we support frequently live lives apart from the mainstream of community life. What we also realize is support organizations are frequently somewhat separate from the community as well. Organizations most often have ties to other social service organizations rather than to other types of community organizations. So mapping can be a useful tool for organizations as they become bridging organizations and work with others in the community. And again, we'll create examples of both types of maps today. The first map we're going to work on are the maps of the person in their community. So you can be thinking about somebody that you know that you might be able to develop a map for and use this process. We're going to be using Lenny for the sake of discussion. Some of you, again, may remember Lenny from the earlier webinars. In this picture, we find Lenny in his community, and we're going to take a few minutes to explore Lenny's life in his community. And I'm still seeing the wrong slide, but if we're on the right slide, there's a visual representation of the different kinds of places that Lenny might go in the community, and that includes places like the sheltered workshop or day center, the group home, the dentist, the doctor, the Knights of Columbus, bowling alley, movie theater, mom and dad's house, McDonald's, Walmart, and the dollar store. There we go. So you can see that the lines are drawn to the places that Lenny actually goes. If you follow those lines, you'll see what Lenny's community is like today from his perspective. Lenny's a guy who's been supported through his school years and early adulthood in very secure and protected environments. He didn't earn a high school diploma, although he went to college through age 21. Lenny now earns peace rate at a segregated day center and lives with 5 other young men. And so you can see that kind of what Lenny's life is like now. And in fact, Lenny's life is a lot like the lives of a whole lot of other people that I've met that experience some kind of disability. On the next slide, we're going to look a little more closely at Lenny's community today and who else in the community uses the places that Lenny goes. This is Lenny's community. We have where Lenny lives, where he goes during the day, where his staff take him in his community when he's not at the workshop. Let's explore how Lenny is part of these different places in his community. You begin to notice that there are layers to his life and how he explores his community. Most of the places that he goes are places other community members also use. They're places like the Knights of Columbus, the bowling alley, the dollar store, McDonald's, Walmart, movie theater, dentist's office, his mom and dad's. These places are integrated, and they're going to be represented by an eye on the map. And I think the eyes will come up so you can see what we're talking about. Yes, okay, so they're represented by eyes on the map. Some are used only by people with disabilities. They're segregated, and they're an S on the map. these places are places that are not used by others in Lenny's community. For example, his group home and sheltered workshop are not options for other community members looking for a place to live or to work. It's important to think about this as we build a picture of Lenny's community, because Lenny has to be an integrated setting in order to be part of the broader community and to build social capital, or at least he has to spend big chunks of time in places that are integrated in order to begin to become part of the broader community. On the next slide, we're going to look a little bit further at this and look at the number of times a month different places are used. How many times a month does Lenny use these community settings? When I think back to all of the different outcome interviews that I've done over the last 5 or 6 years, I realized that many times when I've interviewed staff, they've told me that the person is in the community all the time. Say, how often do they go out? Oh, all the time. And then when you actually map it out or start asking a few more questions, what you find out is that the map often looks like this one does, where in fact they're going out, but it's not very frequently. So if you look in the boxes that have eyes, you'll see that he's only using some of those places once a month or maybe a couple of times a month. We could have also done this with hours, and what you see further is that it's really very few hours when you total it all up. And then you look at the S's, and you'll see that the majority of his time is spent in segregated settings. And what we're wanting to do is increase that ratio so that there's more time being spent in integrated settings so that Lenny has an opportunity to meet people, build social capital, build those connections. So what this map does so far is to visually show you the portion of his time that Lenny spends in integrated settings versus segregated settings. And you can see that the majority of the time is spent with other people with disabilities in segregated, congregate settings. Our goal is for him to spend more time with other community members in integrated settings. On the next slide, we're going to look at who Lenny is with when he's in those settings. So mostly, Lenny spends his time in groups of other people with disabilities. This is usually even true when he goes shopping or bowling. We indicated this on Lenny's community map by putting a G on those locations. So you'll see the G's coming up, and that indicates that those are all settings where Lenny is in a group. The places Lenny goes where he is the only person with a disability are the doctor, the dentist, and mom and dad's house. We used an A for alone to show this on the map. And my bet is doctor and dentist aren't high on his list of places he'd like to go. But you never know. Think for a minute about your own friendships. Where did you meet the people who became your friends? How often did you see them before you became close friends? Typically, we don't form close friendships by seeing someone only once. We also don't typically come to know someone well by seeing them only with a large group of people. We get to know each other one-on-one over the course of time. So far, this map is a graphic way of showing where Lenny is going, whether it's segregated or integrated, how often he's using the setting, and whether he's going with others, that's a G for group, or alone, which is the A. When you think about this map and about how you made your friends, it seems unlikely that Lenny would develop friendships or connections of any kind with other community members. He simply isn't by himself around the same people often enough for this to happen. And again, if you're thinking about working with, say, a team of people who are supporting Lenny in planning, this gives the team a way to reach consensus about where things are now. So they're all agreeing that this is the picture, literally the picture of what Lenny's life is like today. And it's a picture that Lenny also can relate to, add to, participate in, and understand. What is Lenny doing is the next overlay for the map. So we're going to talk about what he's doing in the settings that he's in. Most of the time, Lenny is just there in the setting or present. Maybe at most he's like transacting business, like paying a cashier. He's not typically in settings where he is actively participating in doing things with other people who are community members. There's a T on the places where he is just there and a P on the places where he actively participates with other community members. And again, if you look at the balance with that, the balance is that most of his time is spent in places where he's just there. So now we've added another dimension to Lenny's community life. In addition to knowing whether the setting is segregated or integrated, how often he's using the setting, whether he's going alone or whether he's with others, we now know that whether he's just there or is actively participating with other community members. The reason this is important is that participating requires interaction. And it's through that interaction that Lenny will get to know other people and that they will have an opportunity to get to know Lenny. And that is essential to building friendships. What social roles does Lenny have is the next overlay we're going to look at on the next slide. Social roles and social capital are two different but related concepts that Anne talked about earlier. When we say that people have social roles, we mean that they are acknowledged and recognized, that they assume duties. When we talk about social capital, we mean that people have access to networks which provide them with power, information, and other forms of support. Ideally, social roles might lead to social capital, so they're related. Roles generally lead to social capital, but not always. As you can see from the map, Lenny doesn't really have any social roles. To summarize Lenny's map so far, Lenny is in a number of integrated settings, but spends much more time in segregated congregate settings. When he is in integrated settings, he is in a group with other people with disabilities rather than going alone. Lenny is often just present in the setting rather than actively participating in doing something with other community members. He does not have any valued social role. So far, we've created a picture of Lenny's life as it is today that all of the team members contribute to and can agree on. This consensus of where we're starting is an important first step. And again, I think some of the reason for that is that often I think we make the assumption, people make the assumption, that the person we're supporting is out and involved in the community more than they are, or they don't think through that the ways in which they're out in the community are not likely to lead to friendship or roles or are not likely to increase social capital. So the consensus building piece of it's important, and it begins to give us a picture of where Lenny is today. Now we're going to stop for a minute and focus back on Lenny. What does Lenny want out of life? What does he really want? We've asked thousands of people that question, and in one way or another, they gave us the same answer that Lenny does. The top responses typically are things like natural support. For Lenny, that would be being connected to other people he can count on and who can count on him. Friendships, that's spending the amount of time with the people you want to spend it with, doing the things you want to do together. Social roles, having responsibilities and giving back to others in your community. Intimate relationships, and for Lenny that would be where he could have a sense of trust, a feeling of a level of trust that he needs, and feeling of commitment to another individual or individuals. Somebody that he cares deeply about, that he can talk to, say anything to. And then work would be where Lenny would have a source of income, opportunities to meet others, to have a sense of accomplishment or self-esteem. So to go back to an earlier concept, let's just look at these as opportunities for bridging and bonding social capital. And you'll find more about all of that in the Social Capital Index that we gave you the link to earlier. This brings us to our next poll question. And that question is, To increase social capital for the people you support, you could take people to the movies, take people to the park, take people to a local restaurant, all of the above, or none of the above. I'm going to give you just a minute to respond to that, and then Susan will let us know when we have our answers to the quick poll. Again, the question is to increase social capital for the people you support. You could take people to the movies, take people to the park, take people to a local restaurant, all of the above, or none of the above. And Susan, do we have our quick poll responses yet? There we go. And it looks like most people said all of the above, and a number of people also said none of the above. In a sense, none of the answers is completely right or wrong. All of these things can be opportunities for people, but they depend, it depends on Lenny and his community, and I think the important thing is on what the nature of the specific situation is like. So for example, simply taking somebody to the movies isn't likely to build interaction unless there's an event going on where it's a premiere and you get to sit and talk with people ahead of time, or taking people to the park if it's a regular rec activity that's included in the park, or there's a group of people that meets there at a certain time every day. Then those kinds of things might be places where people could meet and interact. Or same with the local restaurant. Frequently there'll be a group of regulars that get together at a certain time. That could be a way too. So in a sense, all of them could be ways to connect, but in and of themselves, if all you're doing is going and not working on forming any connections and not going back enough so that people actually have a chance to see the same people and interact with them, then that wouldn't be. Then moving on, how can we get Lenny to the point where he has the kinds of social roles that he wants and where he's more involved in his community? To support Lenny in interacting and building social roles, we've got a couple of suggestions. They're not all inclusive, and they have to be driven by what Lenny wants and with Lenny in the forefront. Some thoughts are, we usually make friends with a person, not with a whole group. So again, it's that idea of interacting one-on-one with other people. We don't typically become good friends with someone after having met them just once. You need to see the same people repeatedly for friendship to grow, at least typically. That is what needs to happen. Many people make friends with people they work with, go to church with, or do other things with, like play on a local softball team. So it's that idea of interacting, doing things together, or not just kind of sitting there, but there's some interaction that's involved. We typically make friends with people with whom we have something in common, spending time with people who share common interests. And again, even though I'm saying interaction, so what I'm meaning here, it doesn't have to be verbal interaction. Now, we have lots of examples of people who don't use words as their primary means of communication, who nonetheless develop some form of relationship with other people, and the same kinds of things still apply. They need to see those people frequently, and somebody may need to be helping translate for them, et cetera. So it's not just that they have to be able to communicate, to interact in those ways. So what do we need to know? Is the next slide. Lenny's community needs to expand. We need to support him by learning his interests and finding community settings where there are others who share those same interests. We need to increase the I's, the A's, the P's, and the SR's on the map. So they need to be integrated, alone, places where people participate, and opportunities to develop social roles. We need to increase the number of times that Lenny is in those settings. Sometimes the way we support people in using community settings sets them apart from others. And I'd like you to think for just a minute about trying this out. Sometimes what I've asked people to do, and what I myself have done, is gone out and just sat and watched how other people use a specific community setting, and pay attention to that before anybody with a disability from the local group home gets there. And then when I watch what happens as the folks we support arrive, what I'll see is that sometimes they're the manner in which it occurs is very different. The way they get there, what they wear, what they bring with them, how they interact when they're there, whether they're alone or in a group, all of those things can be very different. And those kinds of things are things that set people apart, sometimes needlessly. And they're things that if we understand how the setting works and what's typical of that setting, we can support other people in learning about those things as well before they get there. And then as they arrive and begin to use the setting. The other part of that is that sometimes people have significant support needs, and so in order to think through how they'll use the setting, it takes knowing a lot about where they're going and how it works ahead of time. So our strategy would be to scope out the setting ahead of time to see how others use the setting. And you'll want to learn things like, what do people wear? What do they bring with them? Are there customs or rules? What competencies or skills do people use in the setting? Then we need to figure out how to support Lenny to use the setting in the same or a similar way that everyone else uses it. So then on the next slide, we need to understand what Lenny's needs or interests are, and then we can locate places in the community where Lenny could go to spend time with others who share those interests. So a couple of thoughts for Lenny are he likes cars, so there's a car up in the left-hand corner. There might be some way to get him involved with cars, particularly with old cars, because he really loves them. There's a choir on the bottom. There's a community choir and a church choir that he might be interested in participating with in some way. And again, even if he doesn't use words to talk, there might be some way for him to interact and communicate in that setting. And then just other ways to develop friendships and get to know people. Then on the next chart, you'll see that, or the next slide, you'll see that we've developed the community support chart. And we learned that Lenny loves antique cars and he loves having coffee. We know that there's an antique car club in town and that a group of guys about Lenny's age meets for coffee every morning at Meg's Diner. So we have two possible ways to expand Lenny's community. But each community, and sometimes each setting in the community, has its own unwritten rules. Think about what you wear, what you take along, and how you act in different settings. Maybe the church, a bar, a baseball game, and work. So each of those settings, you may act a little bit differently in, wear a little bit different clothing, take different things with you. But also, each individual person has different support needs. So the way in which you support somebody may change also based on those settings. So now we need to understand more about each setting. And the slide's a chart for planning out how you will support the person in the community. The column, characteristics of the setting, is about how people in the community use the setting. The column, needed supports, is about how you will support the person in the community. And the next slide gives us a brief example of some of the things that might be included in this slide. Again, in the characteristics of the setting column, we're going to look at, first of all, attire. And the setting is that we're using is Meg's Diner, because that's where a group of people, a group of guys gather every morning for coffee, and the guys are all members of a local car club, and they just gather there and chat in the morning. So you'll see what they wear is informal, what they bring with them, newspaper, cash, local automotive publications. But what else is there about the setting? Well, you have to pay the customs. You have to pay the cashier. You have, if you're a regular there, you typically order without the menu. And they don't. You have to know they don't take credit cards, and they don't have any latte or espresso or any other fancy coffee. The rules of the setting, those guys know each other's names. They know the waitresses' names. They know to leave a cash tip and competencies. People are familiar with the menu. They know, again, they know they have to leave a tip. And then what you do in the next column, the needed support column, is think through what it would take to support Lenny. So you want to think through in that setting, is he okay with the sounds and the smells? Is he okay being dressed in informal clothing? Is that all right with him? Does he have any? He probably does. But then you also have to think about the take with. Does he have singles? Does he have the amount, close to the amount of money that he'll need? In other words, not too much more, and no less than the amount of money he's going to need to order and to pay his tip. And he may also, if he has car magazines, maybe part of his plan has been to start finding and looking through some of those kinds of publications. So he may want to take his own there with him to the diner, so that could go on there too. And you can see through the rest of it the kinds of supports that Lenny might need in that particular setting. The idea, again, is just to know the setting ahead of time and know what Lenny's needs are. And this becomes more important the more complex the setting is and the more complex the support needs are for the individual person. So it gives you a concrete way to sort some of that out ahead of time. So now we're going to think about Lenny's future community on the next slide. And you'll see that now we have other things that we can add to Lenny's map. He goes to Meg's Diner with the regulars every weekday morning. And there's a car club in town that meets monthly and hosts car shows periodically, and some of those guys are the same guys that are the regulars at Meg's. Lenny met Bud and talks with him about the car shows, and now he helps set up for the shows and goes to the meetings. Lenny's community is expanding in ways that increase the likelihood that he will form relationships, and hopefully from that then begin to build some social capital, and he's already starting to develop some social roles as he's a part of the group that helps set up for the car shows. We've increased the IAPSR and the frequency. Now I'm going to turn this back over to Ann, who's going to talk a little bit about mapping the organization and the community.
Thanks, Kate. When we started earlier this afternoon, we were talking about building on two themes of taking a look at community both through the point of view from Lenny and then from the organization supporting him. So let's now kind of move to the theme of the organization and its community. And in this last portion of the webinar, that's where we're going to shift our focus and talk more about organizations and the community and the role of organizations within community. Kate has led us through what community mapping might look like for Lenny or for other people who are supported through your organization. And now our focus will not solely be on Lenny, but on that of the organization who supports him. And in this slide, what you'll see is the organization on the right-hand side, the building, is still rather separate from the community. And this is why a focused effort for organizations on becoming bridges to the community is so important, and in changing the role of what organizations have typically been from charity-based to a contribution-based organization. Two types of mapping that we're going to talk about, or two examples of mapping that we're going to talk about are through the organization and of that of the community in this last portion of the webinar. And you'll notice on the next slide what's very important and crucial to this is that Lenny is still central to the entire process. He is still the larger-than-life guy in the middle of this and is certainly one of, if not the key players in how organizations build their role as bridges to community and to their local environment. Here we see the organization again. It's the blue building, the same one that we've seen before, and it's the organization which supports Lenny and the community that it's a part of. It has some connections to. What we're going to use this map for is how to continue to use this as a way for Lenny to stay essential to this, but also for organizations to build themselves as community bridgers. What we look at for typical communities on the next slide is that we know from our experiences at CQL and with working with organizations for years and years and years is that we know that most organizational connections tend to be with other social service organizations, other human service-related organizations, and possibly a few other community organizations, but not traditionally. In fact, in our visits with organizations who are seeking accreditation through CQL, we know that these type of social service or human service organizations are generally significant partners to the organizations that we work with. When we look at community as a whole, however, we know, and we see here on this typical community map, is that the community is comprised of more than just human service delivery organizations. In fact, we find the majority of the organizations are not human service or social service organizations. So that is one, just an overview of what a typical community looks like. And what now we're going to be focusing on is the purpose or the focus that organizations have. And on the next slide, you'll see a piece of clip art that we found to be rather telling, and what we're looking at in the purpose of organizations is there is a bridge which goes to and from organizations to their community, and it's being supported, and there may be some movement on it. It may not always be static. There's going to be some changes. But we see that also with the briefcase or with the piece of luggage there, that it is a journey. And the purpose of organizations is expanding and is evolving. And what's important to remember is that what all people in the community should be focused on are those things that are same as important to the people within a traditional organization, such things as education and housing and health care and employment are all important to everyone in the community. And it's what we're talking about, the purposes of organizations being is looking about enhancing community quality of life for all people, not just for those that are traditionally supported within their organization. As I said, it's about the journey, and the road can move along the way, and organizations that are adapting and building strong bridging roads with supports within their communities become assets not only to the people that they support, but to their community and enhancing the total health and well-being of their community as a whole. On the next slide, we're going to talk about what communities traditionally have, our needs and assets. From the model that most organizations that we've partnered with, we know that most of the models organizations have been structured on are a deficit-based or a needs-based model. And when we're looking at what the purpose of organizations is and what evolving bridging organizations are doing, our focus really needs to turn to and look for and identify the assets within community. And what we're talking about in the assets, there may be some visible or invisible assets. Some of the invisible assets that we know exist are that people care enough to take action on things, such as local grassroots efforts, or another invisible asset might be relationships that we have in recognizing social networks. The challenges in front of organizations is how to join in community partnerships where we already know that there exist assets with whom we as the organization can collaborate. So it's not finding the needs, but it's looking at the assets. And as we look at the assets, we continue to build community quality of life for all people in our community, in our main street, so to speak. And for your organization to move forward on how to map its community, we would suggest that you need to start to look at what these assets might be. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those assets are and how you might begin to look at that. Some of the assets that we're talking about might be termed as coalitions or alliances that are shown on the next slide, where there already are existing groups or existing coalitions with other members of community, and they've already identified some of the assets that might be needed to address community quality of life, including the people we support. And remember, it's not just the assets or coalitions or alliances that we find within human service-based organizations, but in the entire community. 3 things to focus on when we're looking at successful collective community action, and that's really the purpose or the function of organizations as they become bridges to the community, is how to become successful at partnering and being contributors to community action. The first point that we know that organizations who've been successful have accomplished is to pay a lot of attention to assets versus needs. Use what's already in existence to get where we want to go. So that's really the first point, is pay attention to assets and identify them. Kate was talking about graphic ways to do this before when she was talking about Lenny's map. There are absolutely ways for organizations to do that as they look at the community as a whole. You might find that that same map works for you and that there are assets in certain areas, or you may want to begin listing what those assets are. The other thing to pay attention to is our relationships, those connections that we have. And those may be things that we've not even looked at previously, where there are connections or some sort of relation to another entity. And then the third thing is to really change the way we're focusing our questions and engage from the inside out. And what we mean by that is to start with the question versus the answer. An example might be is, what can we do to help improve transportation in our community, versus we have 10 routes each day that aren't being, that we need to complete, and we don't have the resources to do that. So that's that inside out. Start with the question versus the answer. So what can we do to help promote improvements in areas such as transportation, housing, education, healthcare, which are all important to all citizens in the community. The next piece of the process for organizations to look at are the quality of life priority issues. And in the packet that I mentioned earlier in our webinar, you should have, I think it's like 14 or 15 pages of a document that will help you identify what some of the questions you might want to look at in identifying partners and their community strengths, the community assets. You may want to do this through internet searches or materials that you have available to you, talking with other community members, or even by exploring the community. Through one of CQL's strategies, our 2005 quality measures, is a community life strategy, and in relation to that, there's also a lens workshop that comes with that, and these actual questions that we're giving to you in the handout come from that as a portion of the workshop, where we help organizations develop strategies on how to find those partners. So these are just some of the questions that you might want to enlist as you're beginning your, or as you're continuing on your journey and becoming bridging organizations. These are things to have in mind as you're talking with community members that have a relation to some of those focus areas. An example for employment might be, what is the current unemployment rate? Where are the major issues of employment in our community? An example for a sense of belonging question might be in the area of education, of What kind of youth activities are there for following school? Are there sports? Are there music? Are there cultural activities? And these things, the sense of belonging and the sense of data, or the data questions, will help organizations begin to focus where there are already assets and where there are strengths within the community. What is found during the process of using this is that there are people that are already out there that are experiencing the same issues that people you are supporting are, that there are assets already and strengths in your community that are addressing transportation needs, that are addressing housing needs. And by the end of the workshop, as you take yourselves through this, but these questions don't necessarily have to be only a part of the workshop experience. That's why we've shared them with you. As you begin identifying your community quality of life issues, it will help you identify where the gaps are and where you have already partnerships in existence that you may want to begin to collaborate with and build on, not only for people you support, but as becoming contributors to the community as a whole. On the next slide, it talks a little bit more about how organizations might want to go about doing this in learning, exploring, and experiencing, finding those networks of assets, and then beginning to strategize on how you're going to do this. So some of the beginning dialogue questions for organizations as they're beginning their quality phase or their quality journey as contributors are, what is the community like today in regards to strengths and assets in the area of healthcare, in the area of employment, in the area of housing? What are the priority issues for the members of the community? And what we find over and over again, the priority issues of people who live outside of segregated settings or who are not working in congregate facilities, we find the same issues rise to the top. It is in sync with what possible needs you may have as an organization. What sources of information are going to be your best source to tap into some of the assets and the strengths that you are going to find in your community? And which data will you find most helpful? Is it data that's quantitative or qualitative? And as a part of the workshop experience, or even as organizations use these tools to develop yourselves as contributors to the community, organizations begin to build those community assets, those community action steps. The next piece of this, and we're going through this rather quickly, I understand we're getting closer to the end of the webinar and just want to make sure we do cover these. But there is a certain methodology to this. So as we're taking you through looking at what the coalitions and alliances are, what the assets are within the community life, what those priority issues are, now we're looking at specific community assets to consider. Kate had mentioned before the publication by John McKnight and John Kretzman, and they've written a great deal about mapping of community assets, and in the handouts that we've given you, we've shared through Kate's and my, actually Kate did a lot of research on this through one of their workbooks, a very helpful asset mapping chart that should help you. And these are tips that you're going to find on that chart that help you to be categorized on how to identify the assets of your community. And again, we don't want to be a needs-based focus here. And I know I certainly have a hankering to go back to a deficit-based model. But in finding organizations that have been successful, we know that looking at asset-based and those assets within our community are most successful. So you might be looking at people who live there, the local businesses that are in existence, the financial or the resource-based assets such as human capital and land. And communities have untapped resources and assets that are focusing on the same areas that are of concern to your organization. What you might want to do is take some time after the webinar and again look at the references list that's in the back of your materials, which includes that work by McKnight and Kretzmann, and it will give you some additional information there. The next facet, or the next piece of the puzzle for communities who are changing their role and becoming bridges to the organization, is to really look internally at their organizational capacity. And that will be the next piece of the puzzle coming up on the slide, which talks about members' skills and abilities, the members' ties and relationships, and physical resources. So let's just take a brief look at what some of your organization's assets might be. When we talk about skills and abilities, we're thinking about all the organization's members, and we need to think very broadly about this. This includes staff, but it also includes board members, volunteers, family members, and above all, people who are supported throughout the organization. And what we are looking for is a way to identify skills and talents and abilities of all members. The other portion of internal capacity, a view of internal capacity, is to look at ties and relationships. And again, crucial to remember that we're talking about all the members of an organization. We're looking for the connections to others in the community that might be useful. Who knows who has leverage or who has power within other certain connections that we might want to be looking to. Physical resources such as buildings or land, meeting spaces, vehicles, those are what we're looking at in physical resources. And the financial resources are certainly monies that are currently available or that could be made available depending on how they're refocused. One of the examples that we've recently heard of with organizations who are really looking at themselves in this organizational capacity mode is, as a part of their hiring process, they're including a social capital survey with the new people coming into that organization. And they've begun to capture on an organizational map those capacities and those member skills, abilities, and links that are already in existence. So as they're developing their role as bridges, they've already identified within their organization who might be someone who has these connections. And the drawing of a map of your organizations can be very, very helpful when you're looking about changing your role of how you're going to contribute to solving problems faced by the community. And again, that can be in many, you can do that hand-drawn, it can be done something very ornate if you care to, but what it does is it actually puts in graphic, visual terms what you have available. The next piece is taking a little bit more of an external look at looking at the community capacity. And when we're thinking about community capacity, we are going to think back to some of those community assets that we've talked about. And again, we need to reference the resources and the research we've done with John Kretzmann and John McKnight. And they propose that community assets are in the areas of associations, of physical spaces, of individuals, of institutions. And you'll see on the bottom of this slide there is actually the website to that PDF file that we gathered this information from. You'll find the assets list in your materials, and it's not in any way intended to be an exhaustive list, but rather as a list of some of the categories that might stimulate your thinking. And we've seen organizations who do this on flip charts or on whiteboards and begin to capture information, put it up graphically, and have different ways of looking at it. You, or individually as an organization, can explore your community and help to identify these assets with relation to some of these important areas, such as housing or transportation or health care. So those are some of the things that you might want to begin to look at. And now that we have taken a look at Lenny's community mapping and the process, we haven't given you a particular way that organizational mapping is going to look, because we find that organizations do that very differently depending on how they're structured and how they work and all of that. So that was one of the reasons why we didn't traditionally do that, is it's a start for you to begin that community mapping and a way for you to look at how you as organizations can begin to structure building your role or continuing your role as a bridge to the community and as contributors to solving community issues. And Kate's going to focus a moment back on a particular area for Lenny within the community issues that we've addressed here. And I think the next slide, if I'm not mistaken, before we turn this back, might be a copy of that community asset map that we were talking about, or if not, it's yes, back one. Thanks, Susan. I'm sorry. Oops.
Okay.
Sorry. Let's go ahead and keep going because we're getting short on time. I'm sorry. We'll get that to you. And it's actually the map that I was talking about is in your handouts, so maybe we don't need to take time to look at that right now in the efforts to conserve time.
Okay, if we think back for just a second about what Lenny wanted, we know that he was interested in having natural supports, friends, social roles, and intimate relationships. And if you think about some of the reasons those things are lacking in Lenny's life, there are many of them. But one concern that Lenny faces in all of these areas is that he has no way to get anywhere. And Susan, we're back several slides. So transportation is a concern for Lenny. When we learn more about the broader community, we also learn that transportation is an issue for many people. We find out things that, like, the local hospital has difficulty hiring people because the buses don't run during regular hours, same issue for senior citizens, et cetera. A lot of different groups in the community that have the same issues. So then we do what Ann suggested, and we start thinking through our resources in the community to think about what kinds of things are out there that might be useful. We find things like the local hospital, the senior citizens group, the local factory, the junior college, the carpool to the local company, newspapers, mayor's office, TV and radio stations, self-advocacy groups, a variety of different resources that are present in the community. And Susan, we're several ahead of you now. And then we also think through who the potential partners are. And Susan, if you can find the potential partner slide. And when you think about potential partners, you'll also think about ways to identify both the needs and the assets, remembering again that we're going to try and focus on what some of the assets in the community are. So there are a number of groups that you'll see in the need column that have a need for transportation, and a list is started under the asset column of things that are in the community that might help with the transportation issue. But it's also important to know that sometimes the same place can have needs and be a resource. For example, the local hospital has a need to hire staff and have bus routes that they can access, but they also have a great publication department and great PR department, and they can also be listed in the asset column. So sometimes places are both. And then that's going to, I think we'll skip probably the poll question because we know that there are some questions out there. And what you'll find next, that we'll skip the poll and go to the resource slide. And you should find that you'll have a list of resources that should be helpful to you, could be helpful to you as you try to learn more about community mapping, including the work that was referenced by McKnight and Kretzman, and again our social capital index as well, as some work by, there's also work by O'Brien that's part of the resource list. And I don't know how much time there is for questions, but Susan, do you have questions that you wanted to tell us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There are a couple people asked some questions, and I want to apologize. Clearly my back button doesn't work. One question here was, why wouldn't he be participating at the sheltered workshop and at home? Those are social areas where he has relationships and connections.
Yeah. The issue is participating with other members of the community that aren't in segregated settings. So it would be participating with other people who are not, who aren't in that segregated setting. It's just that it's an isolated setting.
Okay.
Diane, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, and well, maybe one thing. Certainly at home with family members, if family members are sort of the springboard to those continued development of new relationships where Lenny is alone and being supported to take on more of an interactive role, absolutely family can be a large support to that. Yeah.
Okay, and then last question is barriers according to support personnel, service providers, money, gas, transportation, staff with free time, quote unquote, liability issues versus dignity of risk. And I guess maybe if you could address that.
Ann, do you want to start that one?
That's exactly why we talk about developing those relationships based on assets and strengths within our communities, because not only are these things that you as an organization are dealing with, it is also the same type of things that a hospital or an education center or an after-school center or other types of entities that are quality issues within the community, those are the same things that they will be dealing with. And that's exactly why it's important to find those coalitions where they may find ways to work around that or work through that or have ways to alter some of those issues that you bring, because those are not unique to a traditional service delivery organization. Those are the same types of issues that large corporations may have if they're out doing work and, you know, staff time, and if there's issues with regard to resources. There's a lot of the same things that overlap. So it's finding those assets and those coalitions and alliances within the organization, and that's why it takes a purposeful look within your community to find where those are. Because traditionally we've been working with organizations that have the same needs and deficit-based criteria, and we're flopping it completely around to say where are our assets within our community that have already identified or that we know are strengths in these areas. Kate, was there anything else?
And I really think that pretty much covered it.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions that we have.
Well, we just wanted to say thank you, and we've come to the end of the session. Really do appreciate you taking the time to hang with us a few minutes over our allotted time. You'll see our Kate's and my contact information on the screen in front of you, and hope that you'll contact with any additional questions if we weren't able to get to them today or you didn't feel this was the right format for you. You'll also be receiving an evaluation survey soon about today's session, and we encourage you to please give us your feedback so we can continue to make improvements and add to our training offerings. So thanks again, and goodbye. Have a good day.
Goodbye.
Bye.